Hey guys, today I'll be bringing you the much requested video on draw cards in Edison format. I'll be talking about Cyber Valley, Upstart, Legacy, and Reckless, as I believe those are the main draw cards that should be utilized within different decks. There's also some discussion to be had about playing a small Lightsworn package consisting of Lila, Raiko, Recharge, and Charge, similar to what was played in 2012 Chaos Dragons. But that's not for this video. This video is about the four aforementioned cards that you can utilize in pretty much every deck in Edison format in any quantity you'd like. So let's jump right into it. So the first draw card I'll be talking about is Cyber Valley. I've already made a whole video talking about Cyber Valley, but to touch more on its pros and cons in general, I believe it's a card that's very good in decks where you lack a normal summon, or where you just want to fill up the banish zone because it's important for your game plan. So for something like Dimensional Alchemist, you need a monster banished for its effect to be able to get a card back. Well, Cyber Valley is a good card that you can get back because it's good into boards if you have a take card, and it's good to convert your dead monsters or cards like tokens into actual cards that you draw into. It's also a good turn 1 play, so if your deck lacks starters, something like Diva Hero or Dragons, I believe those decks don't have that many starters that you can use turn 1. Cyber Valley is really good in those decks. I wouldn't play Cyber Valley in something like Blackwing, because you already have a lot of normal summons, and it just doesn't work with what you're trying to do. That deck wants to gain advantage off of trading 1-for-1s and capitalize off of plussing from cards like Blizzard, Shura, Black Whirlwind, and just beating their monsters in battle and going +1 that way. This card is better for the more combo-centric decks, so maybe something like Dragon Turbo could utilize this, as well as the other two decks that I've already posted on this channel. There will be more to come for sure. The next card is Upstart Goblin. Upstart, you may think, if you're coming from modern Yu-Gi-Oh, is an obvious include because it's just less cards in your deck and your deck isn't filled with particularly great cards. However, in Edison format, there's an interesting confliction with Upstart, as life points actually do matter. There are quite a lot of games where you lose because you ended up taking too much damage early on, which is why cards like Cyber Valley are good, because they can protect your life points for those combo-centric decks. Because there's a lot of Saki cards in Edison where if your life is low enough, you could just die. There's sometimes you just die to a return being flipped and bringing back a whole lot of monsters, or a Dark Arm Dragon is summoned along with maybe a Brio to bounce your other cards. And that push, they may not have any trap cards left. So if you survive that push, you could then counteract what they did, so they might not be inclined to go for game. But when your life is so low, you end up dying to cards like Kalut or the aforementioned bombs that are just being summoned. You kind of just feel sheezed because they just top deck the brain control. Well, if your life points weren't so low because you ended up taking too much damage early, then you wouldn't have lost. So life points are actually a real resource in Edison format. That's not really the case for current or even some of the modern formats, where it's more so about advantage. There was a lot of games at Euros that I just won when I was down 1 or 2 cards when I played Blackwing, because I won on damage. They couldn't stop my early incremental pushes with Boras, Shuras, maybe even normal summoning a Blizzard, not using the effect just to hit for that 13, because you end up winning a lot of games off of damage. So giving them 1,000 life points is actually relevant, and that's something that you need to take into consideration. I don't believe every deck should play Upstart, just because if you give them too much life, that's effectively buying more turns. If you play one Upstart and you cannot kill them, you have to give them another turn. That's almost like giving them 1 card. Now, they're getting a card when they're severely behind. They're low in life and you just made a push. Also, decks like Zombies, decks like Diva Hero, you have a lot of late game bombs. They're not live early game. Particularly something like Zombies, where you have a large amount of normal summons. So Zombies, I would not play Cyber Valley in, nor would I play Upstart, because if you play Upstart in Zombies, what is your Upstart drawing into? What's it gonna draw into? Recruiters, which are monsters that have to die by battle to be able to get their effects, like Pyramid Turtle and Tomato. Also cards like Goblin Zombie, Diva, all of the zombie cards really. And the cards you're taking out for Upstart aren't really normal summons either. You end up cutting down on maybe one zombie, one trap, and maybe another form of defensive card, because if you take out all your zombies or your engine cards, the math ends up just being worse than if you didn't play Upstart. You will see cards like Goblin Zombie, Diva faster, but the trade-off is you'll also be drawing normal summons more often. So if you look at the games that zombies lose, it's generally because they're clogged on too many monsters, or because they cannot OTK you with their push. The zombie deck does have a good amount of grind game, but when it does its push, it tends to not have too much follow-up after that. If you think of when they use their Masuki to bring back their monsters, they do their 2 synchro plays with Diva. If you just clear their board, what do they really have left? Usually not that much. Now for something that's very popular in the current stage of Edison is Legacy of Yata-Garasu, as well as Jar of Greed if you want to play additional copies of this card effectively. So Legacy is very good in the decks where you have back rows that you want to fade. Set Legacy along with a Bottomless. That Bottomless is way safer against cards like MST, Dust Tornado, Discard Trap. A good player can usually make reads over a couple of turns, and they can determine whether your back row is a summon stopper or a battle stopper or perhaps a bluff. So playing cards like Legacy, where they might think Legacy is something else. They might think Legacy is a Starlight Road. They may think Legacy is a real trap. They may think your real traps are legacies. It just creates such a mind game for the opponent, and as long as you aren't too obvious by looking at your back row when they perhaps commit a play where you can do something, and you just play the game with a poker face, they shouldn't really know whether you have a draw trap or not. These cards are very skillful, this and Jar of Greed, because you need to know when to flip them. It's not just something that you wait until you can chain it for a +1, because a lot of people want blind MST you. It's not something you can immediately activate either, because if you're just drawing a bunch of monsters similar to Upstart Goblin, it loses its purpose of being able to protect your other back row. Legacy is not very good in decks that are super fast. Something like Dragon Turbo, you just end up being too slow with Legacy. And the next card we'll talk about will be way better in that kind of a deck. Also, if the format progresses in such a way where everyone's playing fast, super optimized decks, let's say the meta was entirely Dream Frogs and Dragon Turbo, for example. That probably won't happen, but for the sake of argument, let's say that is the scenario. Then Legacy is terrible, because if you go second and you set Legacy into your combo field, it doesn't do enough. It's really good in the 1-for-1 trade matchups. Something like Hero Beat was a very good deck previously, but that deck has kind of fallen off just because the introduction of Legacy and Jar of Greed, making their Gemini Sparks on your back row not even a +1 anymore. And for the last draw card, it's Reckless Greed, mainly being seen in decks like Dragon Turbo and Kristyasworn, where the 2 turns don't really matter. You play other draw cards like Solar Recharge, Trade-In, etc. You're able to see multiple Reckless Greed. When you see multiple Reckless Greed, they stack up. You're not losing additional draw phases. So you're able to capitalize off of that with a huge push and hopefully win before your 2 draw phases come up. So for Blackwings, I would be playing Legacy of Yata-Garasu and potentially Jar of Greed if you want to play more copies. I would not play something like Upstart Goblin, which may seem like an obvious include in a deck where you want to see Whirlwind as fast as possible. Well, the issue is Blackwing has a lot of normal summons. So let's say you go second, and your hand is Upstart Goblin, a real trap that can protect you, for example a Deep Prison or maybe a Bottomless, and a bunch of Blackwing monsters. If you activate Upstart, yeah, you get to see your next card in your deck immediately. But unless that card is a card that is a defensive card, like another trap card, or is a card that works with the Blackwing monsters. So for example, something like Heavy, so you can remove their back rows and then summon your monsters to be able to be safe from their back rows. If Upstart is drawing you more monsters at that point, you're gonna be wide open for their next turn push. If they have a way to deal with your back row, or they're able to push through the one back row and then do additional plays afterwards, the Upstart is not very good because you're just seeing more monsters. So if you look at the percentage of, okay, which cards will this Upstart draw? Generally when you go second and you're in a unfavorable position where you're losing out to their trap cards, Upstart just ends up being worse than Legacy. Because if you set the Legacy and another trap card, you're kind of forced to believe that at least one of them is a real card. And if they have cards like Dust Tornado post side, they can't just use them to snipe away your one back row and then do their big push. So Upstart ends up seeing a lot of monsters instead, which is not what you want to do. It's better to play the Legacy because you're able to set it and bluff a real trap and force them into a longer game. The way Blackwing wins often is if they have a lot of defensive cards, you grind them out over a couple of turns. You can't really just summon all your monsters and push for game in a single turn through their back rows, because the cards just aren't powerful enough. The trap cards end up being too strong for your big pushes. Something like a Bottomless removing your normal summon immediately shuts off cards like Whirlwind, Gale, Bora, and you need other cards to be able to protect them. For something like Vayu Turbo, the typical deck where you see Raikos, maybe Hamsters, some Kaias, the Vayu and Sirocco engine with Armageddon Knight, Greffers, that's a lot of normal summons. So I would not be playing Upstart because of the aforementioned issue in Blackwing where you just see too many normal summons. I would not be playing Cyber Valley because too many normal summons. In this deck, I would play Legacy of Yata-Garasu because it's very good in Raiko wars. So if you go second into a Raiko, which is a common issue with these Raiko decks, when you go second into their set Raiko and you want to set your Raiko, they're just going to remove your Raiko and it didn't do anything. And it's kind of awkward to attack into a potential face down hamster if you believe it's a Raiko with your Armageddon Knight Vayu, so you usually end up not attacking at all. The best thing to do here is generally to set a Shaneable, something like MST Dust Tornado if they set a back row, or Dust Shoot if they have enough cards in hand, or cards like Legacy, because you can set the Legacy, and if they flip up the Raiko and pop it, you can Shane to draw a card. And for something like the Vayu Turbo deck, where you play cards like Malicious and a much larger Dark Engine with free Greffer, in that deck I could see you playing something like Upstart Goblin, because you have a very specific end goal in mind, and that's establishing a big board and potentially resolving some of TDV or Eradicators to blow away their advantage. You could even play something like Reckless Greed, because you end up playing so many engine cards that your Reckless draws you mainly engine, and then you can push through what they have, and you won't see the two lost to draw phases. In a deck like Hero Frogs, I would consider playing Upstart Goblin if I were to play any at all, just because this is essentially a combo deck where you need to see multiple pieces to work together. However, in this deck you end up not seeing Upstart Goblin being played most of the time. That is because it has a lot of normal summons in all of the hero cards and frog and monarch cards. While giving the opponent 1000 life in a deck like Frog isn't too much of an issue, because you do incremental push with Swap Frog, which usually cancels out the Upstart Goblin life gain, you end up drawing too many normal summons. And the issue with this deck is you have very few defensive cards, as opposed to something like the Frog control deck, with a bunch of more monarchs and more trap cards. In this scenario, your Upstart is mainly drawing you more engine, which can leave you exposed to their pushes. So it ends up not being the best. For the Frog control deck, which some of you may not know what that is, what I mean by that is a deck where you use the Frog cards to be able to gain advantage, and you play a lot more monarchs. You may play something like free Rise Up, free Caius, Testalos to remove a card from their hand, something like Vanity's Fiend to lock out the combo decks, as well as the Frog combo decks. I may do a profile of this in the future, it's something I'm currently working on. It's sort of like a hybrid between the old school Frog Monarch deck, where you just play a bunch of Monarchs, Faders, and Econs, Soul Exchanges. That deck does lose very hard to cards like pulling the rug because you only have one play per turn. But it's also kind of a mix with Dream Frogs, where you end up utilizing Substitute to gain a lot of advantage over time. But it's not exactly like Dream Frogs because you play a lot more defensive cards. If you guys would like to see that profile, please let me know in the comments. In this deck, I would play something like Legacy of Yata-Garasu, because similar to Blackwing, you're trying to slow down the game. You can set Legacy along with some discard traps or other defensive cards and be able to protect your board that way. Now, for Dream Frogs, otherwise known as Fishborg Frogs on the Konami website, this is a combo deck. You could play Reckless Greed in this deck, seeing as you're seeing more cards, you end up being able to get to Substitute way faster. Well, Reckless is a little bit slow, and that deck does still want to play defensive cards, so drawing those trap cards off of Reckless is not very good. So instead I would be playing something like Upstart Goblin, if you chose to play any at all. You don't want to play Legacy or Valley, because you play too many normal summons for the Valley, and the Legacy is just too slow for what this deck is trying to do. Upstart has the issue of drawing you a bunch more frogs, which are all normal summons. When you draw any of your small water monsters, being 1500 attack or lower, along with a swap frog and salvage, you can effectively search Substitute from your deck by special summoning the swap, discarding the water, sending a sub, adding both back, and normal summoning the sub and doing your sub lock turn 1. That deck generally doesn't even have the space to play something like Upstart or Reckless Greed. But if you were to play one of them, I would probably play the Upstarts. For the Fairy deck, we kind of have to separate them into different variants. So something like the Ancient Gear Fairy deck that I recently profiled, I would play Cyber Valley, because it ends up working a lot with the game plan of wanting to play a fast deck. So something like Legacy is too slow, you don't want to give them 1000 life of Upstart, and Reckless doesn't really work in a deck like this. For something like the regular Control Fairy deck, I would play Legacy of Yata-Garasu, because similar to Blackwing, you're trying to play a slow game and you play a lot of normal summons. And the way that deck wins is you go into a late game and you get a lot of advantage over a few turns, and you have way more trap cards to be able to protect your Dimensional Alchemist, so even if it misses on turn 1, you still have another chance next turn. For a deck like Kristyasworn, I would play Reckless Greed. I would not play Upstart, Legacy, or Cyber Valley because of the aforementioned issues in a deck like Kristyasworn. But I would play Reckless Greed because you don't play a lot of defensive cards that are trap cards. Instead, you play defensive cards in the form of Herald of Orange Light and Honest, and the Reckless drawing you into more of your power cards like Solar Recharge, Charge, being able to fill up the graveyard to summon Kristya or JD. Allowing you to do the push way faster is important for this deck. For something like Pure Lightsworn, where you end up playing a lot of trap cards to protect your Lightsworn monsters, you play cards like Glorious Illusion to be able to bring back your Lightsworns from the grave and play a grind game with those cards. I wouldn't play any of the draw cards because there just isn't enough space. The Lightsworn engine is quite big in this deck because you end up wanting to summon JD as your main boss monster. Something like the Kristya deck can utilize cards like Trade-In to discard dead JDs or Kristyas, so you have a way to convert them if you don't have enough monsters in the graveyard. But for the Pure Lightsworn deck, you're really trying to play a long game with the Lightsworns and use them as kind of like Blackwing monsters, where you trade 1-for-1 with their cards. With Lilas, you attack over their monsters, and you end up wanting to mill cards like Wolf. The cards you'd have to cut to play something like Upstart end up being generally your good mills, being your Lightsworn monsters, or even cards like Necrogardna, maybe the third Wolf, because you can't really cut down on too many of the defensive cards. And even cutting down on Lightsworns isn't great either, because you want to make your mills as good as possible. Now for the Dragon deck, it depends which version you're playing. If you want to play the Chaos Dragon deck that I recently profiled, well, I played cards like Upstart Goblin and Cyber Valley to be able to dig through my deck much faster and have great synergy with the Banish Zone, being able to recur back either your Red Eyes or any other strong card with DDR and return, That's why Valley is very good in that deck, and you're able to put a lot of damage on the board, so Upstart giving them 1,000 life is never an issue. However, if you're playing something like Dragon Turbo with Super Rejuve where you're trying to draw your entire deck, I would mainly consider playing cards like Upstart Goblin and Reckless Greed. There is some potential for Cyber Valley being utilized as maybe a 1 or 2 off instead of cards like Vortex Trooper or Card Trooper, but I wouldn't play the full playset because this card ends up being too slow for what the Dragon Turbo deck wants to accomplish. Flip Dragons, where you play Debris Dragon along with Raikos and maybe Snowman Eaters. In this deck, I would consider playing something like Cyber Valley, particularly if you're utilizing cards like Snowman Eater, being able to banish the Snowman Eater after it was flipped when they attacked in with their 1900 or lower monster. You got a +1 off the pop, and now you get a +1 off of the Valley. Amaryllis, I would play Cyber Valley. This card is very good with the Dandelion tokens. Being able to just banish a token for free and drawing 2 cards is very good. Also being able to utilize cards like DDR that you're able to search off of Hidden Armory if you chose to play it. Or if you play the full playset and you elect to not play Hidden Armory because you're playing too many normal summons, Valley works very well with cards like Mind Control, Brain Control, and obviously Mark of the Rose. Zombies. Particularly the one playing Deep Sea Diva to be able to go into 6 stars with Goblin Zombie. I would play Legacy of Yata-Garasu. As I mentioned at the start of the video, you don't want to play cards like Cyber Valley or Upstart because your deck is filled with too many normal summons already. And Reckless has the same issue of drawing normal summons, and the zombie deck wants to play a long game where you hope they attack into your recruiters and you're able to out-advantage them over a few turns. Cards like Reckless Greed are not very good in this deck because you end up just seeing too many normal summons or defensive cards a turn after they're already good. Cards like Legacy allow you to bluff set other back rows while not losing out on your draw phase. For Hero Beat, particularly without Deep Sea Diva, as I believe the Diva variant is inferior in this current format, play a Legacy of Yata-Garasu. I would even consider playing something like a 4th or 5th copy in Jar of Greed, seeing as the way this deck wins is by protecting your own back rows and force them into suboptimal plays. I think in a deck like this, you always kind of just take the L to something like Heavy Storm, similar to Gladiator Beast. But Legacy at least allows you to see if they have the Heavy Storm the first turn. Generally, if you set 2 back rows, they will use their Heavy Storm. And if they top deck it later in the game, well, they top decked it later in the game. You don't lose every game they have Heavy because they need to have a push paired with the Heavy. Sometimes you have a field of Absolute Zero and a bunch of other cards in hand because you're able to grind them out in the earlier turns by doing +1s with Gemini Spark or Hero Blast, and their Heavy doesn't really do too much. For Diva Hero, I would play Cyber Valley. This deck lacks normal summons, at least once there are starter cards. You only really have Stratos and perhaps Diva as your main normal summons on turn 1, so something like Cyber Valley is very good here. It allows you to play cards like DDR and Return way more effectively, which are both bombs in the Diva Hero deck, being able to bring back any of your good monsters. And pitching cards like Mali Plague usually ends up being good for you. For Gladiator Beast, I would not play any of these cards. The only one you could really argue is Legacy of Yata-Garasu. The issue with Legacy in GB is that you're not trying to draw GB on turn 3. You want to see your pairs of a GB and a card like Shrink or Book of Moon as fast as possible so you can immediately tag out the GB. It's better to just play 40 good cards in this deck. For X-Sabers, I would play Legacy of Yata-Garasu and potentially a few copies of Cyber Valley. So X-Sabers has a lot of normal summons, particularly if you play something like Raiko. But if you don't play Raiko in your deck, having a good turn 1 normal summon Valley and being able to easily main deck Brain Control and Mind Control and having more cards that work well with it is good. If you play Quickdraw, either with a big Titanial package in Amaryllis, which you've seen on the E3 Yu-Gi-Oh channel perhaps, or if you're playing the regular Jeff Jones variant, I would heavily consider playing cards like Cyber Valley because they're very good with Dandelion. I think in a deck like this, you automatically just take the L to DDV a lot of the time, so Cyber Valley being another target isn't too much of an issue. You're just hoping to out-advantage them early enough and get to a Drill Warrior, which can recur back your resources and play around the DDV that way. If you play Machina, I would play Cyber Valley in this deck. A lot of people play Hamster Raiko Kaias, but that deck is just worst Vayu Turbo. The Cyber Valley is very good in this deck, being able to have a good turn 1 play that gets you into your engine and protects your life points, as well as being able to summon Fortress from your hand by discarding Fortress and a dead Cyber Valley. Giving you effectively more ways to summon Fortress and attack over their monsters is very important. There is some discussion to be had about playing Machina Peacekeeper along with Machine Duplication for Cyber Valley. Ultimately, I don't believe you have the space in the main deck for that, but it's something to consider. For Ancient Gear variants, I would again, in the Fairy deck, play Cyber Valley. Even if you're playing Machina Ancient Gear, I would not play Upstart, Reckless, or Legacy. Perhaps I would play a couple of copies of Cyber Valley in that case. For gadgets, I would not play any of these draw cards. Upstart has the issue of drawing you too many gadgets too early. That's the reason why a lot of people back in the day used to play 45 cards with their 9 gadgets to have a better chance of not clogging on too many gadgets and playing a lot of 1-for-1 cards. Something like Cyber Valley is not bad in this deck, but you run into the issue of having a lot of normal summons, and something like the Machina engine ends up being a better inclusion in the gadget deck than Cyber Valley. If you're playing Norleras, I would of course be playing Upstart Goblin. The whole game plan of the deck is to get Norleras into the graveyard as fast as possible and being able to pair multiple cards with Upstart. Something like Legacy ends up being too slow. Cyber Valley has the issue of being another normal summon. Reckless Greed is okay. So perhaps if you want to play more than Upstart, you can play Reckless as well. If you play Gravekeepers or 6 Samurai, I would suggest you play 2011 format instead. If you insist on playing these decks in Edison format, I would play Upstart Goblin in both. Upstart being able to see you Gateway and United with your 6 Samurai, and being able to draw cards that way is your main game plan. Or if you're playing Gravekeepers, being able to see Necro Valley as well as Royal Tribute as fast as possible. Here is an overview of every single deck we talked about in today's video. Here you have the decks that work with Cyber Valley. Here are the decks that work with Upstart Goblin. The decks that work with Reckless Greed, Legacy of Yata-Garasu, and the ones I believe you should play neither. If you believe I missed any deck in today's video, let me know in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and found it informative. The next deck I'll be profiling is Diva Hero with Cyber Valley, of course. So stay tuned.